Marshall Chriswell is one of those licensed to practice law in this jurisdiction. Good morning.
Good morning.
It's good to have you with us here this morning. I want to talk about something that we often can be confused about, and that is legal fees. Who pays legal fees? Winners, losers, or both?
Well, the general rule is what we call the American rule, because this is not the way it is in most of the world. But the American rule says that absent some other exception, parties pay their own legal fees.
Oh, okay.
And we're talking about legal fees. We're talking about attorney's fees, as opposed to the costs, the filing fees and things like that, because those are generally paid by the losing party. But attorney's fees, which are generally much more expensive than the costs, are usually borne, the general rule says, usually borne by the party that incurs them.
Okay, and this is obviously in a civil case.
Correct.
And for instance, a lawsuit, one party against another.
Yeah, whether it's individuals, an individual suing a business, businesses suing businesses, individuals suing individuals, it's the general rule is the American rule that parties pay their own attorney's fees, unless an exception applies. But there are lots of exceptions to that rule. Okay, so they come in three general categories. The exception is either by whether the attorney's fees are addressed in provisions of a contract, whether they're awarded by statute or by court order. Okay, so I'll kind of take those one at a time.
Okay.
When we're talking about contracts, so whether it's a contract between businesses that are doing business with one another and have a written agreement that says, in the event there's a dispute over this contract and we litigate it, the losing party is going to pay the prevailing party's attorney's fees.
Okay.
And that's very, very common in business transactions. It is. And also in consumer transactions. Individual enters into a contract with a business. A lot of times that contract will say that in the event of litigation, loser pays attorney's fees. So contracts often spell out exceptions to the American rule.
Would that apply in the case of reading your phone agreement and things of that nature?
Generally not.
Okay.
There are generally rules prohibiting those now. But the way that companies limit their exposure with regard to legal fees in those contracts is they include arbitration provisions.
Okay.
And most of those kinds of your phone contracts or electronic terms of service agreements and the contracts that generally consumers don't have a lot of power to negotiate. They're the things that you just click the box and keep moving.
Without reading.
Yeah, a lot of times there are arbitration agreements in there that say, well, in the event that there's a dispute, you can't go and file a suit in the Court of Common Pleas here, a county court or federal court. You have to use an arbitrator, and that limits attorney's fees because it's a much simpler proceeding generally. So that's with regard to those.
Now, the third thing you said was by judicial ruling.
Correct. So, and this a lot of times arises in the event of a contempt action. So if a court has ordered one party to do something, say there is a trespass case, and it's a trespass to land, and the court has ordered, that the defendant is to stay off of the plaintiff's land. You were trespassing, here's a court order, you got to stay away. And the defendant violates that order, and the plaintiff brings him back to court and says, Judge, he's violated your order. He's in contempt of court. A lot of times in those cases, the judge will then award attorney's fees to in this case, the plaintiff, because the defendant's actions were, just so outrageous. in violating the court order and force the plaintiff to have to come back to court and incur legal fees when there was already an order in place. So that's an exception to the American rule.
Would a court as well also in some cases say, this lawsuit that you brought against this particular client is so outrageously wrong and ridiculous that I'm going to make you pay his fees?
Yep. Frivolous, what we term kind of colloquially as frivolous lawsuits, suits that are brought, the claims don't have any merit, or they didn't have really enough evidence to move forward. In the case of truly meritless, frivolous litigation, courts can certainly award attorney's fees to the party that was dragged into court needlessly.
Now, what are some of the ramifications of that? I'm thinking of somebody who doesn't initiate a legal action, even though they have in their minds a pretty solid case, simply because they say, I can't afford to hire the attorneys to go into court and fight this battle for me. Does that happen?
That does, and that's the American rule has, and like I said, it's called the American rule for a reason. This isn't the way it is in the rest of the world for the most part, but it cuts both ways. Number one, it can encourage people to bring suits because they're not afraid that if they don't succeed for some reason, if their evidence isn't enough to get a successful verdict, that they're not going to be stuck paying the defendant's attorney's fees. Okay. So it encourages people to bring meritorious lawsuits if they need to do that. But you're right; it cuts both ways. It also serves as a deterrent for a plaintiff to bring a case that maybe the evidence isn't that solid, or it's just not economically. It doesn't make sense for them to do that, because one of the very important things that I always discuss with potential clients that are looking to file a lawsuit is, how much can you recover? What's the best possible outcome? And what are the costs going to be? What are the attorney's fees going to be? What are the court costs going to be?
Yeah. And
that's, that economic analysis is important, and it's the American rule forces you to go through that and determine, is this really what you want to do?
Now, what you've just been saying in these last couple of seconds plays into my next question. What are the takeaways from this? What should we know as we're considering court action and we want to hire an attorney? You just hinted at what some of those things are, and that should guide us in what our final decisions will be, correct?
Right. Number one is consult with an attorney early on, before you get too invested in something that may not have the potential returns that you think it will for you. A lot of folks, I don't want to say a lot of folks, but certainly seen a lot of situations where people decide not to hire an attorney right away. They think they have a great lawsuit. They go and they file it without an attorney. They're what we call pro se, no attorney representing themselves. They think, well, I'll get this started, and then if I think I need a lawyer, I'll get him involved later. It's a terrible idea. It's a terrible, terrible idea.
Okay.
Because, and we've kind of talked about this before. Number one, an attorney coming in midstream after you've already maybe made a few mistakes, or the court's made a couple of rulings already that may or may not have been in your favor, is bad. But also, more to the point of what we're talking about today, is that you haven't had the opportunity to sit down with an experienced attorney and say, hey, what is this going to cost me, and does it even make sense for me to file this? So I think that's the big takeaway, is that the American rule forces you to do an economic analysis of your case, and if it's a case of any substance at all, at some point you're going to need an attorney. You're not going to go to trial on your own.
Should people take all of that into consideration when they decide, I don't like the way this company acted, so I'm going to stand outside their business with a sign that tells people to stay away because this company's going to come after me for doing things like that?
You're right. Sure.
All of those things have to come into consideration.
Yeah, I think anything that you're doing that's that potentially could lead to litigation. You've got to think about the different types of consequences that's going to have.
So get an attorney.
You got it.
There's one right across the way from me. Folks want to get in touch with you. What do they need to do?
The number is 465-5826, and you can find me online at www.westernpalawyer.com.
Very good. Thank you, Marshall.
Thanks a lot.
It is Indiana in the Morning, presented by First Commonwealth Bank here on AM 1160 WCCS and 101.1 FM.